After 5 years of saving every dollar for our dream trip, my son called the night before our flight, demanding I cancel it to babysit. Then his wife sent a text that I will never forget. The suitcase sat zipped by the front door when my son's name lit up my phone. I almost let it ring. Something in me already knew. Haley needs you to watch the kids, Ben said. No hello, no sorry, just an order dressed up as news. Our flight leaves in 9 hours, I said. It's just a week, he said. Like a week was nothing at all. 5 years Tom and I had saved for this trip. Every spare dollar folded into a single account we never touched. Not once. Not even when the truck needed new brakes and we found the cash somewhere else instead. We called that account Italy. It sat quiet in a Huntington Bank branch on State Street in Westerville, Ohio, growing while our life happened around it. Ben, I can't, I said. The flight leaves at 6:40 in the morning, so push it back. It's non-refundable. So is Ivy's childhood, Mom. I stood in my kitchen holding a phone in one hand and 40 years of trying not to make my son feel small in the other. I didn't say anything for a second. He filled the silence the way he always did. Haley's a wreck. I'm a wreck. And you're worried about some beach in Italy. It's not a beach. It's Rome. Whatever it is. 2 weeks earlier, Haley had sent me the whole schedule herself. Every date typed out in a group text with a calendar screenshot attached. I answered within the hour. I sent 3 names. Carrie from our church, who'd sat for half the kids on our street. Renata, who ran a licensed in-home daycare 2 doors from them. Jess, 19 years old, 4 years of babysitting behind her, and a mother I'd known since high school. Nothing. 2 weeks of nothing. Now, 9 hours before my flight, it was suddenly my emergency to solve. I already gave Haley 3 names, I said. Good people. Trustworthy people. She doesn't want strangers, Mom. She wants you. Carrie isn't a stranger. She's known Ivy since Ivy was born. Renata runs a licensed daycare 2 doors from your house. It's not the same, and you know it. Grandma is grandma. Nobody else counts the same. Then maybe somebody should have told me that 2 weeks ago, before I sent 3 names into a group chat. Nobody bothered to answer. I was busy, Mom. Work's been insane. You know how it is. I do know how it is, I said. I worked 31 years and never once expected my own mother to rearrange her life because I didn't plan ahead. This is different. How is it different, Ben? He didn't answer that. He never did. Not that night and not in any of the conversations that came after it. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. He tried once more. A text this time, 20 minutes later. And this one landed differently than the others, aimed somewhere I hadn't braced for. What if something happens to one of us while you're overseas and you can't get back in time? Have you even thought about that? I sat with that message longer than I want to admit. I am not a woman who dismisses the possibility of tragedy easily. I spent 31 years watching how fast an ordinary Tuesday could turn into the worst day of a family's life. But I also recognized, even through the fear he deliberately stirred up in me, that a hypothetical emergency 4 months from now was not the same thing as the manufactured one sitting in front of me that night. And I made myself write back only 4 words. We'll take that risk. He didn't reply to that one either. And I noticed, even then, that his silence only ever showed up after I'd stopped giving him what he wanted. The suitcase stood by the door, patient, done being packed for 3 days already. My phone buzzed on the counter, screen lighting up the dark kitchen. A text this time. Haley, don't be selfish. Family comes first. Cancel your trip. I read it twice. My hands didn't shake. I set the phone face down on the granite and walked to the bedroom, where Tom was folding his last 2 shirts into the corner of his suitcase, the way he'd folded shirts for 40 years. Corners first. Everything okay? He asked, not looking up. We're still going, I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I am 63 years old. For 31 of those years, I worked as the attendance secretary at Hawthorne Elementary, 3 blocks from the house where I raised my son. I knew every excuse a child could invent for a stomachache, and every parent who used their kid's sniffle as their own day off. I could tell within about 30 seconds of a phone call whether a parent was telling me the truth or building a story as they went. And I want to say that skill served me well later, sitting in my own kitchen listening to my son build a story of his own, though I wish I'd needed it less in my personal life than I did in my professional one. I retired 2 years ago with a pension, a sheet cake in the teacher's lounge, and a plan. The plan was Italy. My coworkers threw me a small party in the library on my last Friday, and the principal, a woman 20 years younger than me, who'd started as a student teacher under my watch, gave a speech about how I'd been the actual heartbeat of that building for 3 decades, how the teachers came to me before they went to her, how the kids all somehow knew, even the shy ones, that my desk was a safe place to land when the rest of the day had gone sideways. I cried a little that day, the good kind of crying, and I drove home already imagining a terrace somewhere in Rome, coffee going cold in the morning sun. Tom worked 38 years as an electrician for a contracting outfit out of Columbus, the kind of job where you come home with your knuckles split and your back sore and you don't complain because complaining doesn't rewire a panel. He started as an apprentice at 19, wiring new construction houses in Dublin and New Albany, back when both were still mostly cornfields, and he finished his career running crews on commercial jobs downtown, the kind of buildings you drive past without ever thinking about the man who made sure the lights came on. He is not a man who talks much about feelings. He shows love the way he was taught to, in fixed gutters and oil changes, and a hand reaching across a car console at exactly the moment it's needed, and I have never once doubted, in 40 years, that the love was real, even when the words for it were scarce. We married on June 14, 1984, in a church on Schrock Road with folding chairs and a reception in the fellowship hall. 40 years this October would have made an anniversary worth worth marking on its own. Instead, we picked it as the year to finally go somewhere neither of us had ever been. We started the Italy account in the spring of 2019. $50 here, $100 there. The year Tom's overtime came in heavier, we put in $3,000 at once and didn't touch it for groceries even during the month the furnace died. 5 years of small, deliberate refusals to spend money on anything but the thing we wanted most. By the time we booked the flights, using miles Tom had hoarded on an old Delta card since before Ben graduated high school, we had $2,800 left for 9 days of lodging, trains, and food. Not lavish. Ours. Ben is 34. He married Haley 6 years ago. A wedding at a vineyard outside Granville that cost more than our entire trip to Italy. Most of it paid for by us and by Haley's parents, Carol and Frank, in roughly equal parts, though Carol never let anyone forget her half. I remember the seating chart arguments, the string quartet Carol insisted on over the DJ Haley actually wanted, the way Carol referred to the whole event as my daughter's wedding in every conversation, as though the groom's family had merely been invited to help fund someone else's vision. I didn't mind it much at the time. Weddings make everyone a little insufferable, I told myself. I didn't yet understand it as a preview of how Carol would handle every family event going forward, staging herself at the center and expecting the rest of us to play our assigned supporting roles. Haley herself, in those early years, was not the woman who texted me, "Don't be selfish." She was quieter than Carol, almost apologetic about her mother's volume, and she used to send me photos of Ivy unprompted, a habit that trailed off sometime after Eli was born and never quite came back. I don't think Haley set out to become someone who weaponized her own baby's feeding habits. I think she absorbed slowly, the way people do, that guilt worked on this family, that it moved mountains her direct requests couldn't, and she learned to use the tool that was handed to her the same way Ben did. It doesn't excuse what she said in that text. It just means I never once believed she was cruel by nature, only that she'd learned, the way most of us eventually learn something, from watching what got results. Ben and Haley have 2 children, Ivy, who was turning 5 that November, Eli, 18 months old, still not sleeping through the night, still refusing bottles from anyone but his mother, a detail Haley brought up so often it had become a kind of currency. I want to be honest about the kind of mother I was to Ben, because it matters to how this story goes. I was the mother who drove 40 minutes at midnight when his car broke down on 71 his sophomore year of college. I was the mother who co-signed his first credit card in 2016, a Chase card with a $2,000 limit, because a 24-year-old with no credit history can't rent an apartment on his own name alone. Tom and I never came off that account. Ben always meant to apply for his own card and have us removed. He never did, and because of it, we still received a text alert from Chase for any charge over $200, a small residue of a favor from 8 years earlier that neither of us thought twice about. In 2019, the year we started saving, we gave Ben and Haley $15,000 toward the down payment on their house in Powell. We didn't call it a loan. We called it a gift, because that's what you call it when you love someone and you're not thinking yet about what it costs you to keep giving. The pattern didn't start with the trip to Italy. It started 3 years before, in the fall of 2021, when I was supposed to fly to Charleston with 3 friends I'd known since Ohio State, Pam, Denise, and Karen. We'd planned it for a year, 4 days, a rental house 2 blocks from the water, plane tickets bought in January. Ben called me the Tuesday before we left. Haley was 7 months pregnant with Eli at the time, on modified bed rest for high blood pressure, and Ben told me he was drowning, that he couldn't manage Ivy and a stressed pregnant wife and his job at the same time, that he needed me, so I canceled. I lost my share of the deposit, $340, and a long weekend with women I still, to this day, don't see often enough. Nothing catastrophic happened while I was there. Haley rested. Ivy watched a great deal of television. Ben worked his normal hours. It was, in the end, an ordinary week that I turned my life upside down to help manage, and I told myself it was fine, because that's what mothers do, because Haley really had been pregnant and really had been scared, and because I loved being needed even when I resented it. I never brought the money up again. I never told Ben how it felt to hear, weeks later, that he and Haley had gone out to a nice dinner that same week I canceled my trip, using a sitter they hadn't thought to offer me. I just filed it away the way you file away a splinter you decide isn't worth digging out. I told myself I wasn't keeping score. I was keeping score. I just hadn't added it up yet. There was a smaller incident too, the Thanksgiving after Eli was born, one I'd almost forgotten until all of this forced me to remember everything at once. I'd spent 3 days cooking, the way I always did, turkey and 2 kinds of stuffing and the sweet potatoes Ben had loved since he was 6 years old. Haley called that morning to say they weren't coming, that Eli had a low fever and she didn't want to risk the drive. I understood. A sick infant is a sick infant. What I didn't understand, until Carol posted photos 3 hours later, was that they'd driven 40 minutes in the opposite direction to spend the day at Carol and Frank's instead. Eli bundled in a onesie. Fever apparently manageable enough for that trip, but not for mine. I never said anything about it. I ate turkey with Tom and told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't the kind of mother who counted holidays like poker chips. But I noticed. I have always noticed. I simply got very good at pretending I hadn't. I think about Ben as a boy sometimes, trying to find the thread between that child and the man who called me 9 hours before a flight and told me Ivy's childhood was non-refundable too. He was an easy kid, easier than most, the kind of boy who brought me dandelions from the yard like they were roses and cried at his own birthday parties because he felt bad for the kid who didn't get invited. Somewhere between that boy and this man, he learned that love could be measured in what people were willing to give up for him, and I have spent more nights than I'd like to admit, wondering how much of that lesson he learned from watching me. That was the shape of us before the trip to Italy broke it open. I was the emergency contact for a family that never once asked whether I had an emergency of my own. Haley sent the schedule for the week of our flight 14 days before we left. A calendar screenshot in the family group text. Block colors marking who needed to be where. I read it that same afternoon, sitting on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, and I answered within the hour with 3 names, 3 phone numbers, and a note that all 3 women already knew the kids from church and the neighborhood. 2 weeks of silence followed. I checked the thread twice, wondering if maybe they'd worked it out on their own, hired someone, asked Carol, solved it the way 2 capable adults with 2 working incomes solve a childcare gap. I didn't push. Tom told me not to borrow trouble. If it was urgent, he said, they'd have called you back by now. He was right that it wasn't urgent. He was wrong about what that meant. 9 days before our flight, I sent one more text. Gentle, no pressure. Just checking, did you land on a sitter for that week? No reply. 6 days before, I tried Haley directly instead of the group thread, thinking maybe she'd answer without Ben in the conversation. Hi, Haley. Just following up on childcare for the week we're away. Carrie's still available if that helps. I watched the little bubble appear, disappear, appear again, the way it does when someone starts typing and thinks better of it, then nothing. I told Tom about it that night, sitting on the back porch with the last of the summer heat still in the air, and he shrugged the way men shrug when they've decided a problem belongs to someone else. They're grown adults, he said. It's not our week to plan. I wanted to believe him. Some part of me did believe him, right up until the following week, when the silence turned into something that felt less like an oversight and more like a decision. I've since wondered whether Ben and Haley assumed all along that I'd cave eventually, the way I always had before, and that the silence itself was never really about disorganization at all. It was simpler than that. They didn't need to plan around me because they didn't believe deep down that I'd actually get on that plane without them. I told myself silence was an answer. I told myself, wrongly, that the answer was that they didn't need me. Then came the night before our flight, my son's voice on the phone with no hello in it, an order dressed up as news, and a suitcase already standing by the door. I hung up on Ben that night and stood in my kitchen a long time before I moved. Tom came out in his undershirt, saw my face, and didn't ask what happened. He just started making the coffee we'd need to be up by 4:30. My phone rang again 40 minutes later. Ben, I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes after that, my phone rang a third time, and I answered only because I wanted to hear, clearly, what he intended to say next. Mom, I don't understand why you're being like this, he said. His voice had that particular wobble he used when he wanted me to feel the size of his disappointment. I offered 3 sitters 2 weeks ago, I said. You never called any of them. Haley doesn't want randoms watching her kids. They're not randoms. Carrie's known Ivy since she was born. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Ben? Silence stretched out on the line. I could hear a television somewhere behind him. Low volume, the particular blue static of a kid's show. When he spoke again, his voice had changed shape entirely, gone soft and wounded. The point is, you'd rather go to Italy than help your own family. I've helped this family for 34 years, I said. I am allowed 1 week. Wow, he said. Okay, good to know where we stand. He hung up first. I stood there holding a dead phone and felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to grief, the early kind. The kind that shows up before you've lost anything. Warning you. 20 minutes later, Haley's text landed. Don't be selfish. Family comes first. Cancel your trip. I read those 11 words more times than I want to admit. I thought about the 3 years I'd spent quietly resenting the Charleston trip I never got to take. I thought about $15,000 I never asked to be repaid. I thought about Eli, who still wouldn't take a bottle from anyone but his mother, a fact I was fairly sure had less to do with Eli and more to do with how convenient it was to keep saying it. I did not reply to the text. I set the phone face down on the counter, and it buzzed once more before I could walk away from it. Carol's name on the screen this time, not Ben's, not Haley's. I almost didn't answer. I answered anyway, mostly out of the same curiosity that had made me answer Ben's third call earlier that night. Diane, I just got off the phone with Haley, Carol said, her voice pitched somewhere between concern and accusation. She's beside herself. I raised 4 kids without ever once asking my mother-in-law for a favor she wasn't willing to give. I offered 3 sitters 2 weeks ago, Carol. That's not the same as family, and you know it. I do know it, I said. Family didn't return my texts for 14 days and then called me 9 hours before my flight. There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a woman recalculating her approach. All I'm saying, she said softer now, is that trips can be rebooked. Grandchildren can't be unneglected. Nobody is neglecting anybody, Carol. Ivy and Eli have 2 capable parents and 3 trustworthy sitters available to them. What they don't have is a grandmother willing to hand over 5 years of savings because nobody bothered to plan ahead. You're being awfully cold about this. I'm being awake about it, I said, and I hung up before she could answer, my hand steadier than I expected it to be. I turned the phone face down on the counter and went to bed, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I slept through the night without checking it once. We left for the airport at 5 in the morning. My phone stayed in my purse, silent, until we were through security and sitting at the gate with coffee that tasted like cardboard and hope in equal measure. It rang twice before boarding. I let let both calls die on their own. It rang a third time as they called our zone. I looked at Tom. He nodded, the small nod of a man who'd been married to me long enough to know exactly what I was about to do, and I answered it standing in the boarding line with my ticket already in my hand. Mom, this is serious, Ben said. I know it is, I said. So am I. If you get on that plane, don't bother calling us when you get back. I felt the words land somewhere behind my ribs, sharp and cold, and I made myself breathe once before I answered. I'll keep that in mind, I said, and I hung up, and I handed my ticket to the woman at the gate, and I walked down the jet bridge with my son's threat still ringing in my ears, and my hand steady on the handle of my carry-on. Tom took my hand once we sat down. You sure about this? He asked again, quieter this time, because he already knew. I've never been more sure of anything, I said, and I meant it more the second time than I had the first. I turned the phone to airplane mode as the wheels lifted off the runway in Columbus, and somewhere below us in a kitchen in Powell, Ohio, a phone I wasn't touching for the next 9 hours was about to start ringing. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. When we landed in Rome and I finally turned the phone back on, standing in a customs line under fluorescent lights that made everyone look faintly seasick, the screen lit up like a slot machine paying out. 41 missed calls. Dozens of texts stacked on top of each other. Timestamps climbing through the night while we slept somewhere over the Atlantic. Some begged, some raged. One, sent at 2:14 in the morning Ohio time, said only, "I'm not doing okay right now, Mom." I read that one twice, standing there with my passport in my hand, and it still didn't change my answer. I have thought about that message more than any other one he sent me, before or since, because some part of me still wonders what it cost him to write it and what he expected it to buy. Then there was one from Haley, sent hours after Ben's. The sitter cost us $800. We had to use rent money, $800. Our entire trip, the one we'd built for 5 years, cost $2,800, paid months in advance, planned to the dollar. I read her text standing in that customs line and felt something in my chest go very still and very clear, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I didn't reply. Tom and I found a cab, found our rented apartment 2 blocks from the Pantheon, and by the time the sun came up fully over the rooftops of Rome, I was sitting on a small stone terrace with coffee that tasted like nothing I'd ever had in Ohio, watching the city wake up around me, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 3 years, like a person who was allowed to want something for herself. But I want to be honest, I wasn't finished, not even close. Before we ever left for the airport that morning, before Ben's last call, before Haley's text about the rent money, I had already saved every message, every date Haley typed into that calendar screenshot, every name I'd offered and the exact minute I'd sent them, every read receipt that sat there, blue and silent, for 2 full weeks with no reply. It had become a habit of mine over the last 3 years, a quiet, careful habit, screenshotting things I hoped I'd never need. I printed all of it the morning of our flight, 22 pages, while Tom loaded the car, and I folded the stack into a plain white envelope and tucked it into the zippered pocket of my purse, just in case someone, someday, tried to rewrite what actually happened. For 9 days in Italy, I didn't think about that envelope once. We walked until our feet ached in Rome, passed the Trevi Fountain twice because Tom insisted the crowds would thin the second time and they never did. We ate pasta in a trattoria the size of our dining room, run by a woman who called Tom Bello, and refilled our wine without asking. We stood inside the Pantheon and looked up at the Oculus, rain from an afternoon shower falling straight through the hole in the ceiling onto the marble floor below, and neither of us said anything for a long time, because there wasn't anything worth saying over that. We took a train down the coast on our 5th day, the water turning a color I didn't have a name for yet, somewhere between blue and green and something else entirely. We stood on a cliff above the Tyrrhenian Sea in Positano, and Tom cried just a little and told me it was the best thing we'd ever done together. I believed him. I still do. For 9 days, my phone stayed mostly in the bottom of my purse, and I let myself be a woman with no one to answer to but her own husband and her own feet, sore and happy, on cobblestones 4,000 miles from a kitchen in Powell, Ohio. I thought about Ben only twice the entire trip, both times briefly, both times pushed away on purpose. Once, on the terrace in Rome, watching an old man teach his grandson to fold a paper boat at the next table. Once, on the train south, watching a mother settle a fussing toddler with nothing but patience and a soft, repeated word I didn't understand. Both times, I let the thought surface and then let it go, the way you let a leaf pass by on a river instead of reaching in after it. We flew home on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, an invitation arrived in the family group text. Ivy's 5th birthday party, the Saturday after next, at Ben and Haley's house. Carol, Haley's mother, had apparently taken over the planning, and she posted about it with the enthusiasm of a woman staging a small production. I hadn't even typed my reply yet when Carol posted again, this time not about balloons or cake flavors. Some people choose vacations over their own grandchildren. Interesting priorities. 12 people liked that message within the hour. My sister-in-law Linda didn't. My nephew Derek didn't. Everyone else did, including I noticed Ben. I didn't respond in the chat. I've never believed an argument gets better for being fought in front of an audience that already picked its side before you said a word. Instead, I went and found that plain white envelope still in the zippered pocket of the purse I'd carried through customs, and I sat at my kitchen table and read through everything in it one more time, slowly, the way you reread a letter you already know by heart but need to hear again anyway. 2 weeks after we landed, 3 days before Ivy's party, my phone buzzed with a text alert I almost didn't open. It was the kind of automated message I'd gotten 100 times over the past 8 years and never once read past the first line. Chase fraud protection. A charge of $3,400 was made to Cielo Azul Resort and Spa, Playa del Carmen MX, on your account ending 4471. I sat with that message for a long moment before it meant anything to me at all. Tom and I had co-signed Ben's first credit card back in 2016 when he was 24 and building credit for the first time, and neither of us had ever come off the account. We got these alerts constantly, small automated pings for things Ben bought that were none of our business, and we deleted them without reading, the way you stop noticing a clock ticking in a room you sit in every day. This one I read twice, then a third time. Then I opened my laptop and did something I'd never once thought to do in 8 years of receiving those alerts. I looked up the charge date, June the 14th, 4 months before our flight to Italy, 4 months before Ben ever called demanding I cancel it, a $3,400 non-refundable charge to a couple's resort in Mexico, booked for the exact week Haley's calendar screenshot had asked me to clear. I wanted to be sure before I let myself believe it, so I did something that surprised even me. I looked up the resort's number and called, using the excuse that I was checking on a booking for my son, Ben Marsh, confirming the dates before a family trip of my own. The young man who answered, cheerful and unbothered, confirmed exactly what the fraud alert already told me. A 5-night couples package booked in June, check-in on the Tuesday our flight to Italy departed, check out the following Sunday. Non-refundable, he added helpfully, as though that detail might comfort me rather than confirm it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, feeling something shift underneath everything I thought I understood. This had never been about a childcare emergency. There was no crisis, no gap in coverage neither of them could fill. My son and his wife had booked their own week away, paid for it in full 4 months ahead of time, and had simply expected me to disappear my own plans so theirs could happen for free. When I said no, they hadn't canceled Mexico. They'd paid $800 for a sitter on top of $3,400 already spent, and then told me in a text I would never forget that the $800 had come out of their rent money. I thought about the Charleston trip I lost in 2021, the $340 I never mentioned again. I thought about $15,000 toward a house I was never repaid and never asked to be. I thought about a woman standing at a customs desk in Rome, reading the words "Don't bother calling us when you get back," and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, exactly what I was going to do with that plain white envelope. I printed the fraud alert. I printed the confirmation email I found in an old shared photo account Ben had set up years ago for the family calendar, one he'd forgotten I still had access to, one that had synced the resort booking automatically the day he made it. 24 pages now instead of 22. I folded them all together and put the envelope back in my purse, and I RSVP'd yes to Ivy's birthday party. The morning of the party, Tom asked if I was really bringing it. Some things need daylight, I said. Not a group chat. Ben texted an hour before we were due to arrive. Please don't make this weird, Mom. Just come and be normal. I typed back 4 words. I kept every message. He never replied. I got dressed. I checked the envelope one more time before we left, the way you check a pocket for keys you already know are there. Tom grabbed his own, and we drove the 18 minutes to Powell in a silence that didn't feel angry so much as settled, the quiet of 2 people who'd already decided something and were simply driving toward it now. Carol met us at the front door with a smile made entirely of teeth. "Glad you could fit us in," she said, loud enough for the half of the backyard already visible through the screen door to hear her. "I always make time for family," I said, and I meant every word of it more than she understood. The backyard was full by the time we found a spot near the fence. Balloons in pink and gold, a sheet cake with Ivy's name in looping frosting, aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors, the whole sprawling apparatus of a family that had spent the last 2 weeks deciding, without asking me a single question, exactly what kind of woman I was. Haley wouldn't meet my eyes when we came through the gate. Ben stood by the grill, gripping a spatula he wasn't using, the way a man holds something when he needs his hands to have a job. The party moved toward the cake table around 2 o'clock, the way parties do, pulled together by some invisible current. Carol raised a plastic cup of lemonade over her head and cleared her throat, and 30 people quieted down to listen to her the way they always did. "To family," she said, "who actually shows up when it counts." Every face in that backyard turned toward me. I felt the weight of it, all 30 pairs of eyes, waiting to see if I'd shrink the way I always had. I reached into my purse instead. My fingers found the envelope, cool and solid under the flap. I pulled it out, and I opened it slowly enough that the sound of the paper unfolding was the only sound in that yard. "Since we're talking about who shows up," I said, "I'd like to actually talk about it." Carol's smile faltered for the first time since we'd arrived. "Diane, this isn't the place. You made it the place 2 weeks ago," I said, in front of 12 people who liked your post before I'd even had a chance to explain myself. "So now I'm going to explain myself here, in front of everyone who read it." I held up the first page. "This is the schedule Haley sent me 14 days before our flight. This is my reply, sent within the hour, with 3 names of trustworthy sitters." This is 2 weeks of silence after that, right up until the night before our flight, when Ben called demanding I cancel a trip we'd saved 5 years for. Ben's face had had gone the color of old paper. Mom, don't do this. I already did it, I said. I did it by getting on that plane. This is just me telling you why. I turned to the next page. This is a fraud alert from Chase, sent to my phone because your father and I never came off your credit card after we co-signed it 8 years ago. A charge for $3,400, made in June, 4 months before our trip, for a couple's resort in Mexico, for the exact week you told me was a childcare emergency. The yard had gone completely silent. Even Eli on Haley's hip had stopped fussing, as if he too sensed something had shifted in the air. You didn't need me because Haley was drowning, I said, looking at Ben now, only at Ben. You needed me because you'd already spent $3,400 on your own trip, and you wanted me to cover your kids for free so it wouldn't cost you anything else. When I said no, you paid the $800 for a sitter anyway. And then Haley texted me that it came out of your rent money. It came out of your rent money because you'd already spent your vacation fund on a vacation, not because I chose Italy over my grandchildren. Haley's voice cracked when she finally spoke. That trip was for us, for our marriage. You don't understand what things have been like. I understand you asked me to give up something I'd saved for 5 years so you could have something you'd already paid for, I said. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice you both made, and you made it hoping I'd never find out the difference. Carol had gone very quiet, her lemonade sweating in her hand, untouched. I turned toward her last. You told this whole family I chose a vacation over my grandchildren, I said. Your daughter chose a vacation over telling me the truth. I'd think about which one of those you want to keep defending in front of everyone here. Frank, Carol's husband, who had said maybe 11 words to me in 6 years of family gatherings, cleared his throat from the back of the crowd. Carol, he said quietly, maybe let's just have the cake. Carol rounded on him, her cup still in her hand. Frank, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us, standing here listening to it, he said, and it was the longest sentence I'd ever personally heard him say. Carol's mouth opened and closed once, no sound coming out, the closest I'd ever seen her come to being at a loss. Nobody moved toward the cake. You're airing our private business at our daughter's birthday, Haley said, her voice climbing now. Eli starting to fuss on her hip at the sudden tension in his mother's arms. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I have some idea, I said. I stood in a customs line in Rome reading a text that said my grandson's sitter cost more than I make in 2 weeks of my pension, paid for out of money you didn't have because you'd already spent it on yourselves. I know something about humiliation too. Ben set the spatula down on the edge of the grill, finally, and walked toward me, his jaw tight. For a second, I genuinely didn't know what he was going to do. What he did was stop 3 feet away and say, quietly, just for me, though half the yard could still hear it in the silence. Why couldn't you have just called me first? Privately. I tried, Ben. For 2 weeks I tried, with 3 names and my phone number, and nobody answered until it was an emergency you'd manufactured yourself. I'm done being the person this family only calls when it's convenient to need me. I could see, in that pause after Ben's question, the exact moment the yard finished rearranging itself around what I'd said. A cousin I barely knew, someone from Haley's side, quietly moved her lawn chair a few feet closer to where I stood. A small, wordless gesture that felt like the opposite of what Carol's post had asked of everyone 2 weeks earlier. An older woman I recognized as one of Carol's church friends whispered something to the man beside her, and I watched his eyebrows rise as she spoke. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered. That's not how these things go, not really. Not outside of a story built for an ending. What happened instead was quieter and truer. Linda, Tom's sister, walked over and put her hand on my arm without saying a word. Derek, my nephew, looked at Ben with an expression I'd never seen him wear before. Something between pity and disgust. A few people drifted toward the drink table, suddenly very interested in refilling cups they hadn't finished. Carol set her lemonade down on the table like it had gotten too heavy to hold. I folded the envelope closed, put it back in my purse, and walked over to wish Ivy a happy birthday, because none of what happened that afternoon was her fault, and I wasn't going to let it touch the one part of that day that still deserved to be sweet. We left 20 minutes later. Tom didn't say anything until we were back on the highway, and then he just reached over and took my hand off the console and held it the rest of the way home. The weeks after Ivy's party unfolded the way I imagine a house settles after an earthquake nobody saw coming. The walls still standing, but every crack suddenly visible in daylight. The family group text, once a steady stream of photos and small talk, went silent for 4 days. When it started up again, it was Linda who broke it, posting a photo of her garden with a caption about tomatoes, as if daring anyone to pretend the last month hadn't happened. Ben didn't call for 11 days. When he finally did, I let it ring twice before I answered, not out of spite, but because I needed the extra few seconds to remember who I wanted to be on that call. Haley and I are having a hard time, he said. No preamble. The way he'd said everything that October night 9 hours before our flight. Things haven't been good for a while. That trip was supposed to fix it. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. And I was. That's the part people don't always believe, that you can be furious with someone and still ache for the parts of their life that are genuinely falling apart. You made me look like a monster in front of the whole family. I made you look like exactly what you did, I said. I didn't invent the charge. I didn't write Haley's text. I just stopped letting other people tell the story instead of me. He was quiet for a while. In the background, I could hear Eli babbling at something, the particular pitch of a toddler narrating a world only he understood. Carol's furious at Haley, he said finally. She feels like Haley embarrassed her. Carol built a stage and handed her daughter daughter the microphone, I said. She doesn't get to be surprised by what got said on it. We didn't resolve anything on that call. I don't think either of us expected to. But it was the first conversation in years where my son didn't ask me for something, and I noticed that, and I think somewhere underneath his anger, he noticed it too. Linda called me the night of the party itself, before I'd even had time to process what had happened in that backyard. She'd left early, right after Carol's toast, and she wanted me to know she was proud of me, a phrase I hadn't heard from another adult in longer than I cared to admit. I watched you carry that family for 20 years, she said. I always wondered when you'd finally put something down. She told me about her own daughter-in-law, a smaller, quieter version of the same story, favors extended and never returned, and we talked for almost an hour, two sisters-in-law comparing the particular loneliness of being the woman everyone assumes will simply handle it. It was the first time in years I'd felt like someone in this family actually saw the shape of what I'd been carrying, rather than just benefiting from it. Derek called me the week after the party. My nephew, 26 years old, Linda's boy, someone I'd babysat myself back when I still had the energy to chase a toddler around a backyard. He wanted to make sure I was doing okay, he said, and then he told me something I hadn't known. Ben had asked him, months earlier, back in the summer, to help move a couch into the new nursery they'd been planning for a third baby, a plan that had apparently since been quietly shelved. Derek said Ben had complained the whole afternoon about money being tight, about Haley wanting things they couldn't afford, about feeling like he was drowning under the weight of everyone's expectations. Derek hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was just Ben, venting the way Ben always vented. But he called me because, after the party, all of it suddenly read differently, and he wanted me to know that not everyone in this family had been surprised by what came out of that envelope. I always figured you did more for him than he let on, Derek said. I just didn't know how much more. I thanked him for calling. I didn't tell him it was the first time in weeks I'd cried about any of it, not from anger this time, but from something closer to relief, the particular relief of being believed by someone who had nothing to gain from believing me. Tom said something to me the night of the party that I've held on to since. We were lying in bed, the house quiet, the drive back from Powell still sitting heavy in both of us, and he said, "You didn't do that for revenge, did you?" It wasn't really a question. No, I told him. I did it because I was tired of being the only one in this family who had to prove she was telling the truth. He was quiet a moment, and then he said, "Good, because it never looked like revenge to me. It looked like the first time in years you let yourself be believed." I've thought a great deal in the months since about how much of this family's dysfunction ran quietly for years because nobody wanted to be the one who said something first. Derek had watched Ben complain about money without connecting it to me. Linda had watched me absorb favor after favor without ever asking whether I minded. I had watched myself do it too, for 20 years, telling myself silence was patience and patience was love, when really it was just fear of being the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the mother who kept score. It took a fraud alert from a bank, of all things, cold and automated and utterly indifferent to any of our feelings, to finally make the truth impossible to keep filing away. The financial fallout landed harder than I expected, and not entirely the way I would have wanted. The resort in Mexico, non-refundable, sat unused, $3,400 gone into a week neither of them ended up taking, since by then Haley said she couldn't imagine getting on a plane with him. Ben lost more than money that fall, though he was slower to admit it than the rent shortfall. He mentioned to Linda, weeks later, that a few of his own friends had heard about the party secondhand, the way things travel through a family, and that one of them, a man he'd known since college, had made an offhand comment about the resort that stung more than Ben expected. It's a strange thing to watch a person begin to understand, in real time, that a story they've told about themselves for years no longer holds up once the people around them have the full picture. I take no pleasure in that part. I only note it because it was real, and because grief and consequence in this family arrived braided together in ways I hadn't fully anticipated when I first opened that envelope. Rent that month came up short by more than the $800 they'd already spent on the sitter, and Ben asked his father, quietly, separately from me, for a loan to cover it. Tom said no. It was the first time in 34 years I'd heard Tom say no to Ben about money, and when he told me about the call afterward, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, he looked more tired than I'd seen him look in a long time. "I told him we love him," Tom said. "I told him that's exactly why the answer's no this time." It cost Tom something to say that word to his own son, more than I think either of us admitted out loud that night. He'd never once turned Ben down for money in 34 years. Not for the used car at 17, not for the security deposit on his first apartment, not for the wedding, not for the house. I watched my husband sit at our kitchen table with a coffee going cold in his hands and understood that he was grieving something too, a version of fatherhood where saying yes had always been the same thing as showing up. We didn't talk about it much after that night. Some griefs are better carried quietly side by side than picked apart out loud. Haley went back to work full-time that January, something she'd been putting off since Eli was born, and I heard through Linda that most of her new paycheck went straight to covering the gap the resort had left behind. I felt no satisfaction hearing that. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't want them to suffer. I only wanted them to stop expecting me to be the one who absorbed the cost of their choices, and those turned out to be two very different things, harder to hold apart than I expected. I found out later, through Linda, that Ben and Haley started marriage counseling in December, a fact that reached me sideways, the way most true things about my son reach me now, through other people people rather than through him. I don't know what happens with that. I hope it works. I mean that honestly, without any bitterness folded into it, because whatever went wrong between us, I have never once stopped wanting good things for the boy I raised, even as I stopped being willing to pay for them myself. Haley texted me in March, out of nowhere, a message longer than anything she'd sent me in 6 years of marriage to my son. She said she was sorry, not just for the text about rent money, but for the years before it, for letting guilt become the language she used with me because it was the language that had always worked in her own family growing up. She told me Carol had run her childhood the same way, love handed out in proportion to sacrifice, and that she hadn't realized until therapy how much of that pattern she'd carried straight into her own marriage and her own choices with Ivy and Eli. I read that message 3 times over, sitting on the same back porch where I'd once told Tom I was sure about getting on that plane, and I noticed my own hands didn't shake reading it either, the way they hadn't shaken the night I read Haley's first text. I don't know how much of that message was true, and how much was the kind of thing a person says when they've finally been caught and want the caught feeling to stop. I chose to believe most of it, not because I'm naive, but because believing the worst about someone forever is its own kind of exhausting, and I've decided I don't have the energy left to carry that particular weight for the rest of my life. I wrote back 3 sentences. I forgive you. I still love you. I'm not going back to being the person who says yes to everything, and I need you to understand that difference matters to me. She hasn't brought it up since, and neither have I, but something in our texts since then has felt a little more like 2 people talking to each other, and a little less like one person managing the other. Carol called me in January, 5 months after the party, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. She apologized in a roundabout, self-protective way for the group chat post, though she spent most of the call explaining why she'd felt justified writing it in the first place. I accepted the apology anyway, not because it was a good one, because I decided I didn't want to carry Carol around in my chest for the rest of my life, taking up space that belonged to better things. There is a particular grief that comes with a fight like this one, and it isn't the grief of losing someone completely. It's smaller and stranger than that. It's the grief of realizing the version of your child you'd been carrying in your mind, the sweet, grateful boy who used to run to the door when you came home from work, has been slowly replaced over the years by someone who calculates what you owe him. I sat with that grief more than once that winter, usually late at night, usually with Tom already asleep beside me. I mourned the relationship we could have had if I'd said something 3 years earlier, after Charleston. Instead of filing it away like a splinter I told myself wasn't worth digging out. I don't know if speaking up sooner would have changed anything. I only know I wish I'd tried. Ivy still calls me sometimes, on Haley's phone, in the particular breathless way 5-year-olds narrate their entire day in one unbroken sentence. I take those calls every time, and I try very hard to keep my voice light for her, because whatever her parents did, she didn't do any of it, and she deserves a grandmother who doesn't make her carry the weight of an adult argument she'll be old enough to understand in 20 years, if she ever needs to understand it at all. In February, Haley asked stiffly, over text, whether I'd be willing to take Ivy for an afternoon so she could get some rest before a follow-up appointment with the counselor. I said yes before I'd even finished reading the message. I drove to Powell on a gray Saturday, and Ivy ran to the car the way she used to before any of this happened, and we spent 3 hours at the Children's Museum downtown, and not once did either of us mention her parents, her brother, or Italy. She fell asleep in her booster seat on the drive home, cheek pressed against the window, and I sat at a red light on Sawmill Road and let myself cry for exactly as long as the light stayed red, and then I wiped my face and drove the rest of the way in a silence that felt, for the first time in months, almost peaceful. There is a particular grief that comes with a fight like this one, separate from the grief of the fight itself, and it showed up most often in small, ordinary moments I didn't expect. Folding a onesie of Eli's that had been left in my car months earlier, finding an old photograph of Ben at 7, gap-toothed, holding up a dandelion bouquet he'd picked from our front yard like it was something rare. I missed the boy in that photograph more than I ever expected to miss a grown man who was still, technically, alive and well and 34 years old. I've come to understand that you can grieve someone who is still in your life. You can mourn a version of a relationship even while the person attached to it keeps calling you every few weeks, careful and polite. Neither of you quite the people you used to be to each other. Ben and I speak now, roughly every 2 or 3 weeks, careful conversations that stay mostly on the surface, the way you test ice before you decide whether it will hold your weight. We haven't talked about the resort again since that call in November. We haven't talked about Charleston at all. Some things I've learned don't need to be relitigated once they've been said clearly a single time. They just need to be lived with differently going forward. It's been 10 months now since I stood in that backyard and opened an envelope I'd carried through customs and back. Tom and I are already saving again, a smaller account this time, one we're calling Portugal, though we haven't set a firm date. We don't talk about it as urgently as we talked about Italy. There's less to prove now, to ourselves or to anyone else. I still see Carol occasionally, at school pickups and the rare family gathering that still manages to assemble everyone in one yard. We're polite to each other now, careful in a way that feels almost like respect, though I don't think either of us would call it friendship. Frank waves at me across parking lots sometimes, a small gesture that means more to me than I expected it to, coming from a man who used to say almost nothing at all. I retired 2 years before any of this happened, thinking my working life was the part part of my story that had already been written, that whatever came next would simply be the quiet second half. I didn't expect that the real test of everything I'd learned in 31 years of managing other people's excuses would show up in my own kitchen on a Tuesday night, 9 hours before a flight. I'm glad, in a strange way, that it did. I don't think I would have known what I was capable of otherwise. Most mornings now, Tom and I sit on our own back porch with coffee, the way we used to before any of this happened, and we talk about small things again. What the Portugal jar needs by December. Whether the tomatoes Linda keeps posting about are worth trying in our own yard next spring. Whether Ivy will want to come with us somewhere, someday, once she's old enough to remember a trip instead of just being dragged along on one. I let myself imagine that sometimes, an older Ivy on a terrace somewhere, asking her grandmother questions about a summer decades gone, and I let myself hope Ben and Haley will have found by then whatever it is they're still looking for. I hope it for them, honestly, the way you hope for weather you can no longer control but still care about. I still think about that customs line in Rome sometimes, the phone lighting up in my hand, 41 missed calls stacked on top of each other like a small, furious mountain. I think about the message that said, "I'm not doing okay right now, Mom," and how it still catches somewhere in my chest even now, even knowing everything I know. Loving someone and refusing to let them use that love as leverage turned out to be two things I had to learn to do at the exact same time, and I'm not sure I've entirely finished learning either one. What I know for certain is this: family doesn't come first simply because someone says the words loudly enough or often enough or in front of enough people willing to nod along. Family comes first when it's built on truth instead of guilt, when the people in it can say no to each other and still be loved the next morning. I spent 34 years believing that saying yes every time, no matter the cost to myself, was the same thing as love. It wasn't. It was just fear wearing love's clothing, and it took a plain white envelope and a fraud alert from a bank to finally show me the difference. We saved 5 years for that trip to Italy. I'd trade almost nothing to have those 9 days back. The stone terrace, the coffee, Tom crying quietly on a cliff above the sea. But I didn't just come home with photographs. I came home with a fraud alert I almost deleted without reading, and a truth I'll never be able to unknow, and a family that looks different now than it did before I got on that plane. Smaller in some ways, steadier in others. Mine, finally, in a way it hadn't been in a very long time. I think sometimes about what would have happened if that fraud alert had never come through, if Tom and I had finally gotten around to removing our names from Ben's old credit card the way he always promised he'd let us do. I would have gone to that birthday party with only the printed messages, the schedule, the silence, the sitter cost. Enough, maybe, to hold my ground, but not enough to fully unmask what had actually happened that week. I don't believe in fate. Not really. Not in any tidy sense. But I do believe that the habits we keep out of old loyalty sometimes end up serving us in ways we never could have planned for. And I've stopped feeling guilty about the fact that an old, half-forgotten favor from 2016 is the thing that finally handed me the truth. Some nights I still take that envelope out of the drawer where I finally put it to rest, the pages soft now from handling, and I read through it once, slowly, not out of anger anymore, but out of something closer to respect for the woman who printed it at 5 in the morning, hands steady, already knowing she'd need it someday, even if she couldn't have said exactly why. I don't think that woman was cold, whatever Carol called her that afternoon in the backyard. I think she was tired of being the only adult in the family required to prove her love with sacrifice, and I think she was right to be tired of it, and I am proud, in a quiet way I don't often let myself feel, that she finally said so out loud. Some people choose vacations over their own grandchildren, Carol said, in front of 30 people who liked the post before I'd said a single word in my own defense. She wasn't wrong that a choice got made that October. She was only wrong about who made it and what it actually cost.